obligated to do remarkable things.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Well, I think partly because life is so difficult and challenging that unless you give it everything you have, the chances are very high that it will embitter you, and then you'll be a force for darkness and not good.
Welcome back, guys, to another episode of another episode of Vibes and Insight with Nando. Today's episode will be about destroying your negative beliefs. I know that my platform isn't really on this type of topics, but I'm bringing this kind of topics to my platform so you guys could stay tuned and hope it benefits you in every way and shape. So, the person for this podcast is Chris Williamson. His name is Chris Williamson, and shout out to Chris Williamson. I hope I don't get copyrights for this, but I'm just gonna enlighten some of my viewers and my fans out there on, destroying your negative beliefs and staying positive and trying to think ahead, follow your intuition and moving forward in life and getting whatever you desire to get. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, and hope y'all guys stay tuned and remember to hit that like button and that notification bell. Subscribe. All right, let's go.
So, the fact that life is short and can be brutal can terrify you into hiding and avoiding, but it can also, you can flip that on its head and understand that since you're all in anyways, you might as well take the risks that are adventurous. And that's a very good thing to understand. And what is also useful to understand in that manner is that there isn't anything more adventurous than the truth. This is something that took me a long time to figure out. Well, you can craft your words to get what you want. And people do that all the time. They craft their words so they can avoid taking responsibility for things they should take responsibility for, or they can craft their words to gain an advantage that they really don't deserve.
So it's like this. I'm on a path to try to achieve better things, try to grow and elevate in life. And these stuff and conversation resonates with me so well. It builds me at the same time, and it gives me hope in advancing whatever I desire to be. So I just find it sensitive and sentimental. And I just thought about sharing it with you guys and hope y'all guys like it and everything. But what he's speaking about is some real gems, and I hope you guys follow what he's saying and, grasp everything that he's speaking about.
That's what you do when you manipulate. And the problem with that, you might say, well, why not do that if I can get what I want? And the answer to that is, you aren't necessarily the best judge of what you need. And it's easy to be deluded in what you want. And that's the sort of delusions that people chase if they chase power. If you decide instead that you're going to just say what you believe to be true, you have to let go of the consequences. Mm-hmm. And you might think, well, I don't want to let go of the consequences because I want to control what's going on.
Facts.
But what you miss then is adventure, because if you don't control what's going on, you don't know what the hell's going to happen. And maybe that's exciting. And actually, there's no doubt about it. And then you have the additional advantage if you're attempting to say what you believe to be true and attempting to act in the manner that you think is most appropriate. That's genuinely you, and you have the force of reality behind you. Obviously, that's what you have if you're trying to, say, live in the truth, is you have the force of reality behind you. That seems like a good deal.
That's
then you
facts.
have the reality and the adventure. So why is that a moral obligation? Well, if you hide and you don't let what's inside of you out, and you don't bring into the world what you could bring, and you become cynical and bitter, you will start doing very dark things.
Facts.
So you'll start, not only will you not add to the world what you could add, but you'll start being jealous of people who are competent and doing well and work to destroy them. So that's the pathway to hell.
That's facts. So in a sense, being jealous and envious, it's not it's a natural thing, but it's not to say come alive out of you as a person. It's like you haven't found the way to achieve what you want to achieve. You haven't found a way to embark on whatever dreams that you want to embark on. So it's like you seen others making it out there successfully. You naturally starting to get jealous and envious of others is because, and that also is the devil's work, and the devil's taking over you because you could have, but you didn't. And then when you see others doing what they want to do, it's like this. That's when jealousy starts to take over you.
So
one of the trends that I've been railing against most recently has been cynicism. There's this pervasive belief that everything is terrible and it can't get better.
Yeah.
And the people who believe that it can improve are dumb and delusional and the problem.
That's
and
facts.
I don't know where it comes from. I don't
well,
like
it's
it.
the beginning of wisdom. Cynicism. This is part of the reason why it's hard to combat. You know, because people start out naive. And naive people are optimistic, but not really. They're just naive. And naive people.
One thing I learned about certain things in this life, if you want a thing in this life, you gotta imagine it, believe it, and then you can work on achieving it. So it's like to say, fake it to make it, but you gotta believe it. You gotta be naive in whatever you believe in, and in wanting to gain or achieve out of life. So it's a saying of faking it until you make it, but you don't have to let the outer world know that you're faking it on the inside. You just tore it on the inside and still make it to believe it.
Have no idea that there's, say, malevolence in the world. They have no idea that there's malevolence in their own heart. They're sheltered and dependent. And when that breaks, it often breaks into cynicism. And so cynicism is actually an improvement.
The veils have fallen from your eyes.
Exactly. The problem with cynicism is that, especially if it's allied with a kind of arrogance, is that you can end there. And that's a big mistake. So then the question becomes, well, once you've been bitten hard and you're no longer naive, well, that is very hard on your optimism, let's say. So then the question is, how do you restore that without reverting to the naivety, which you can't do anyways without blinding yourself once you've been bitten? And the answer to that is you substitute courage for naivety, and you regain your optimism as a moral imperative, right? So one of the things you might ask yourself is, well, if the future is likely to be catastrophic in a variety of different ways, which is definitely the case, both socially and personally, then what attitude should you bring to bear on that? And the answer might be, well, if you were courageous and faithful, and I can explain what that means, then you would conduct yourself in a manner that met the future head on, with the presumption that you can manage it. And this is the presumption we should bring to bear politically. You know, the people who are using fear to garner power point to the various apocalypses that might befall us. And it's difficult to counter them because the future is always an apocalyptic horizon. Like everything can fall apart and has before and might well again and will, in fact, in your life as you age and die. And so it's very easy to conjure up an apocalypse.
It's like a whole cycle.
Then the question becomes not, is that apocalypse potentially real? Because the answer to that is yes, but what attitude should you have towards that? Naive, that's not good. Cynical, that's better, but it's still not good. It's another form of hell, and it also tends to make the potential apocalypses more likely. Well, so what do you have when you move beyond cynicism? And what you have when you move beyond cynicism is wisdom. And that's not naive, it's courageous. And one of the things that religious people have done relatively badly.
This old podcast is like a year. It came out a year ago, this old podcast episode. So I just came across it and I just thought about, jumping on it, and because it's sparking some interest on my medulla. You see what I'm saying? So I felt like the need to just jump on it so y'all could really understand what really is out there and what life is really about and what you got to do and the path that you got to create to go on so that you could achieve whatever you seek to achieve, you know?
Especially in recent years, is they failed to delineate the relationship between faith and courage. You know, people like Dawkins and the New Atheists, they point to faith and they describe it as something like belief in foolish superstitions. But that isn't really what faith in the deepest sense means. It means that you are willing to act out the proposition that you can ride the wave no matter how big it becomes. And that we can all do that together, especially if we do that in goodwill. And I think that's a much more appropriate way to confront the future, and it's also the proper medication for cynicism. Now the other thing about cynicism that's interesting too is that cynics aren't cynical enough about their own cynicism, right? Because you can get doubtful enough to start doubting the validity of your own cynicism. It's like, what makes you so smart? What makes you the judge of being? And the Columbine kids were like that, you know, they decided that existence itself was unsustainable given its cruelty, and that the proper response was to put up a giant middle finger to men and God, right? Well, here's a way of being cynical about cynicism. How does your cynicism let you off the hook, right? How does your cynicism justify your desire to avoid necessary responsibility and to pursue your own short-term hedonic gains? It's like, why aren't you cynical about your own doubt? And that's another place where wisdom begins.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, that's two, right? Cynicism beats naivety, but it's not the ultimate destination. And you should be cynical enough to question the moral validity of your own resentment and your own, what would you say, your own turning away from the world.
The way that I see it, given that we don't know the future, given that much of our motivations are invisible to us.
Meet Asana, a work management platform that helps companies get more done and save more time. Teams can stay connected while they track updates and visualize timelines. Asana, a smarter way to work. Try it for free today at asana.com.
We're not a crystal pond that we can see into. You have to have some form of delusion about what's going to happen in the future. You're trying your best to see the way that it's going to be, but
That's
given
true.
that the glass could be half empty or half full, why not have a delusion that's going to...
That, what he just said, it is very interesting. You have to be some sort of delusional to think what the future is going to be like. It's like you're shaping it in your own way, in your own form. You're not expecting it to appear on you like the night. You know? You're just prepared. It's like you're getting yourself ready and prepared for it. Being delusional to it, like curving it in your own way. And it's like everyone,
hope.
future is different.
In the face and the understanding that things might be difficult and that there's going to be obstacles.
You know, there was a line of social psychology that pursued that argument for quite a while, but made the argument that people had to have positive illusions about the future, and that was the fundamental way that people staved off despair and bolstered their self-esteem. But I don't think we need to separate out the distinction between fantasy and delusion.
Yeah, that part.
You do have a fantasy about the future. You have to, because like you said, it's not structured. So you have to provisionally map the future. That's what a plan is.
Positive
That's what
goals.
a strategy is. Right.
Strategize.
But that doesn't make it a
Strategize.
delusion. Like, it becomes a delusion when the map bears no relationship to the underlying territory. So if you have a strategy for the future, maybe let's say that your strategy for the future, just for the sake of argument, is that you have 5 million YouTube subscribers in 3 years. Well, you have no evidence of the strict sort that that's how it's going to be, because anything could happen between now and 3 years from now, let's say. But there's no reason to call that a delusion. It's one hypothetically possible path of potential. And then you can make the sacrifices necessary to bring that about. So even though it's a fantasy, because it maps something that isn't there, it's not a delusion. It's a delusion when you're ignoring
The
elements
facts.
of your own experience
Yeah.
that would inform your fantasy more effectively. You're ignoring them so that you can live in a positive representation of the future without having to pay the appropriate price for it.
So it's
One
not
of
a
my favorite
delusion.
ideas I learned over the last couple of years is the inner citadel.
It's more like
Acai Berlin.
strategizing
You know
your
this?
future
So
in a sense.
Acai Berlin says, when the natural road toward human fulfillment is blocked, human beings retreat into themselves, become involved in themselves, and try to create inwardly that world which some evil fate
Right.
has denied them
Yeah.
externally.
That's a delusion often.
If you cannot
Wow.
obtain from the world that which you really desire, you must teach yourself not to
Not
want it.
to.
If you cannot get what you want, you must teach yourself to want what you can get.
Oh
This is a
wow.
very frequent form of spiritual retreat in depth into a kind of inner citadel in which you lock yourself up against all of the fearful ills of the world. Mutual friend Rob Henderson explained it in a simpler way. If your leg is wounded, you can try to treat the leg, and if you can't, then you cut the leg off and denounce that the desire for legs is misguided and must be subdued. And I think that we see this everywhere.
Well, okay, so imagine that you lay out a plan and it meets with an impediment and it knocks the slats out from underneath the plan. Okay, now you retreat. Okay, now you have an option when you're retreating, and one option is to construct a world in fantasy where you're taking revenge on those who wronged you and getting what you want. That's a pathway to madness. So often people who develop serious delusions do develop, what would you call them? They're compensatory fantasies, and then they start to dwell in them, and often for hundreds of hours. So the kids, again, who shot up the Columbine High School, they dwelt in a fantasy world for hundreds of hours before they undertook their dreadful actions, right? But you can also flip back into yourself, let's say, and you can, this is like confession and atonement. It's the proper way to think about it, is you can think about what it is that you did wrong or insufficiently that led to the collapse of your plan. Right, so that's the first investigation. I made some sacrifices. I attempted to bring about a particular form of the future. It didn't happen.
It didn't happen.
Okay, why? Well, the world is set against me and the cosmos is evil and there's no God and I'm bitter and cynical. That's one potential explanation,
Yeah.
right? Poor me, right? And I'm not trying to be flippant about this because sometimes people's dreams are quite realistic and they still fail catastrophically.
Yeah, that's true.
It can be brutal. You know, maybe you did make a lot of good decisions and you suddenly got ill or someone in your family did. And everything
Died.
went to
Yeah,
hell.
everything went
It
south.
doesn't have to be because you've done something cardinally foolish that you fail. You know, it's built into the structure of the world. It doesn't matter. You can also retreat into yourself and you can say something like, all right, I need to retool my conception of strategy, but also potentially my conception of goal. You know, maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. Maybe I have to look somewhere else. And you can open yourself up to a revelation. So there's a gospel statement that's very relevant to this. So Christ tells his followers that if they knock, the door will open. If they ask, they'll receive. And if they seek, they'll find. And so it sounds magical. It sounds like the sort of thing that the new atheists would have a field day with. But that's not a wise interpretation of that saying. The proper interpretation is something more like a recognition of the way thought works. So imagine your plans didn't work out.
This
And now
way.
you sit down and you say to yourself, I'd like to know, even if the world was conspiring against me and my failure was 95% the fault of external occurrences and other people, what did I do that wasn't as good as it could have been, and where did I fail to look so that the probability of my failure was higher? Now, to ask that question, you have to want the answer. That's what it means to knock
To
or
knock.
ask or to
Yeah,
seek.
yeah,
This,
yeah.
this is no joke. It's like you have to want to know.
Yeah.
And it's a very painful thing to do because
Knock and
especially
you
if
shall
you have
receive.
given it your all to the degree you were able, and you have reason to be bitter, you're going to be searching for the errors that you still made, and discovering your own errors is always extremely painful, right? Especially if they're errors that you're in love with. And so you have to be willing to strip yourself down. That's what humility means fundamentally. And then, but the advantage is, this is why it's so useful to listen to people. You might find out where you're stupid, and then you can stop being stupid. And so one of the reasons you confess your sins, let's say, is because you want to discover where you're insufficient.
Going wrong.
Now,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
painful. It's painful to encounter an impediment in the form of someone else's opinion that might show you where you're blind and ignorant, or willfully blind even. But the advantage to that is you can rectify the error, and then as you move forward, you're stronger. One of the things I taught my kids, and I hope at least somewhat successfully, was that you should always ask a stupid question. And that doesn't mean...
Yeah, that's true. That is so true.
Who wasn't paying attention would ask. If you're listening to someone and you don't understand...
There's always a saying, if you get it wrong, it is okay. If you get it wrong, it's okay. At least if you try again, you will get it right. So you get it wrong to get it right. So it's always good to ask questions that are out of this world or bizarre, but still, when you ask those questions, you could definitely get the right answer, right?
What they're saying. And you reveal that. You're revealing your ignorance. And maybe you're in a room full of people and you think
that's why we learn.
Stupid enough to not get it, which is very rarely the case, by the way. The thing is, though, if you reveal that ignorance to yourself and to the other person, they can rectify it. And if you do that 1,000 times, you're not ignorant anymore. And this is a real pathway to success, too. You see it, you do this because you ask real questions in your podcast, and Rogan does this. Okay, Rogan's always trying to be a little smarter than he already is. And then that works. Iterated, like if you ask 1,000 dumb questions and you listen to the answer, then you know 1,000 things, some of them deep that you didn't know before.
Yeah, it's true.
So that's the advantage to
that's true.
Searching your soul, let's say, for unrequited sins and attempting to atone. That's not a delusion, right? It's an attempt to set yourself right. It's the opposite of a delusion, even though there can be a fantastical element to it.
Yeah, the conversation around people who try their best, do as many things right as they could, and yet still fall short because the world is random and unfortunate things happen. Happiness, as far as I can see it, sits in the gap between your expectations and reality. But the problem here is that people who have high standards often end up feeling a lack, right? How can people who strive like this avoid feeling despondent at falling short of their own high standards? Like when you talk about the statue of David saying something like, you are not all that you could be.
Yeah.
And as soon as you posit an ideal, you begin to compare yourself to that ideal.
Yeah.
So
now that one is to say, life can always humble you no matter what. Life could always humble you. Your standard might be like this high, and life could just keep you right here. Life, it's all about life. It could humble you. And perception is key. You gotta be careful what you perceive life to be like, and always remember that your standards are not always going to be just like that as you put it. It's not going to always be up there. Sometimes it could fluctuate.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the ultimate ideal is also the ultimate judge, because the ultimate ideal is something against which you fall far short.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be so painful that you can barely stand it. But then what you do is you two things, I suppose, is you lower the ideal and you raise your estimation of your potential.
Possibility. Yeah.
And what do I mean by lower the ideal? Well, if you're comparing yourself to someone or even to a future self, and the gap is so painful
far
that it
apart,
paralyzes you,
mm-hmm.
then you've created a dragon that you don't have the tools to master.
Shit.
And so what you have to do is you have to scale the dragon down to size. And you want to scale the dragon down to size until it's a size that you are willing to move toward, however small that is. Now, if you're here and your ideal is here and that gap is unbearable, then you reduce the gap and you reduce the gap. And you're going to have to do that anyways, because you're not going to move from where you are to perfect in one fell swoop, right? There's going to be incremental steps. So you have to fill in that hierarchy of progression.
It's like you're playing a game and you reduce it to amateur level.
So that you can start to move
Not
forward.
professional, but amateur.
And then you should be buttressed. There's another gospel comment that's very interesting. It has to do, it's called the Matthew principle. And the Matthew principle is, To those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. Now, it's brutal because it implies that reality works like this. When you're moving up, you go like this. Right? And that's pretty nice. That's a lot better than this. But when you're going down, you go like that, right? It's like downhill, cliff. Okay. So you want to avoid the downhill path. Well, if the uphill path is like this, which is like exponential, let's say, or geometric, then what that means is that
whatever you do it for less at Harbor Freight.
It doesn't matter how big the first steps you take uphill are, even if they're trivial, even if they're shameful in their size, because you're so useless. That if you're disciplined in that, you'll speed up extraordinarily rapidly. And so that's the good news, you might say, is that you can take very...
To be honest, this is a whole life lesson conversation. I hope y'all like it, and then I hope y'all are getting all the informations and the knowledge from what these guys are speaking, bro. It's a whole life lesson, and I'm just so in tune and in touch with everything that they're saying. It speaks volume, bro, and its level of motivation.
Steps, even ones that might be shameful in their size, and you have to admit that to yourself. But once you get the ball rolling, it doesn't roll in a linear fashion, it rolls in a geometric fashion. And this is a really good thing to know, because it can take the sting out of the realization of your own stupidity. It's like, you know, everybody has their weak sides, let's say, things they're embarrassed about. When I first started going to the gym, I was like, how old was I? 1985, 23. And I think I weighed 135 pounds, and I was 6'1", very, very thin.
That's thin,
right,
bro.
27-inch waist, something like that. And I smoked like mad, and I drank too much. Like, I wasn't in good shape.
23.
The first attempts forward I took in the gym, I went to this swimsercise class. Jesus, it was me and this like really fat guy, young guy, probably not in any worse shape than me, and like 7 old women, over 70, and they could outswim me.
Wow.
Like, it was pretty damn humiliating. And so I did a semester of that and got myself in somewhat better shape. And then I started to go to the gym to work out, to lift weights. And that was also rough because, you know, I'd be underneath the bloody bench press trying to lift 75 pounds off the rests. Shit. And, you know, some muscle-headed bastard would come over and tell me how to do it. And it's like, yeah, thank you. But, you know, it's embarrassing, and lots of times people won't do things like go to the gym because they're so embarrassed about how they look what sort of shape they're in.
What people would think, too.
It's a pain to start at the bottom, but you start at the bottom where you're weak. And if you want to rectify what's weak, you have to accept the fact that you're at the bottom and that the first steps are going to be painful. You know, it took me about 3 years, but I stopped smoking, and then I stopped drinking, and I gained 40 pounds of muscle in like 3.5 years, something like that. I basically had to stop doing that because I had to eat like 6 times a day. It was crazy.
To gain the weight and then work it out.
A lot more physically confident and a lot more coordinated, because working out with dumbbells makes you coordinated, right? Because it exercises all the small ligaments and the tendons. And so my lower body in particular got a lot more coordinated. Then I could dance, so that was better when I was going out dancing, because I did a lot of that in graduate school. But the point of all this is, if you're going to rectify your weaknesses, you have to admit your insufficiency to your own shame. Now, if the gap between you and your ideal is so great that it paralyzes you, you shrink that, right?
We'll get back to talking to Jordan in 1 minute, but first I need to tell you about Maui Nui venison. Maui Nui venison is the most protein-dense and nutrient-dense red meat on the planet. Thank you.
That was
Plus,
cool.
they're the only stress-free, 100% wild-harvested meat available. My favourite method for cooking it is straight from frozen. Salt the hell out of both sides, 12 minutes in an air fryer at maximum temperature, turn it over, 12 minutes again, and it is perfect every single time. It is such a life hack. Actually taught to me by Jordan's daughter, Michaela, and all she does is eat meat, so...
Man, I'm bound to reach levels like this, bro. I am bound to reach levels like this. All I gotta do is just put in the work and believe. But man, I'll be procrastinating so much, but shit, I just need to put in that work and take it serious, because this is awesome, bro. The whole podcast and everything.
Spectacular, but the venison steaks have been my new favorite while I've been traveling on the road. You can get the healthiest red meat on the planet delivered directly to your door by following the link in the show notes below, or going to mauinuivenison.com/modernwisdom using the code modernwisdom at checkout. That's 20% off by going to mauinuivenison.com/modernwisdom and modernwisdom at checkout. One of the things I've been talking about in the live shows is your comparison group is incorrect. The fact that, you know, we have the opportunity to sit down and listen to anybody on the planet, right? The best minds, the best athletes, the best thinkers, the most articulate that are alive right now, or listen to the people that have died that were around when video cameras existed. And you can compare yourself to that group.
Yeah.
But that's not your comparison group. If you have the impetus to sit down and listen to me and you waffle on for 3 hours about these deep topics, these interesting ideas, you are so already selected out of the normal group. Mm-hmm. You're already asking yourself questions that
the right questions.
almost nobody else is, right? But because your comparison group are people that are unbelievably high performing. I remember before I started my podcast, I'd listen to you or to Sam or to Joe, and I think, God, their recall is amazing. It's like they've just got this eidetic memory, and everything that they've ever read is able to come to the surface, and they're able to say it in this way that's completely seamless and all of.
Jordan Peterson, bro, he's one of those walking legends, bro. He's amazing. Jordan Peterson, bro. Shit. It's just the way he gets it, the way he puts it out there. You could totally understand everything that it resonates with you, bro. It's just crazy. Motivational speakers are awesome.
But you go, okay, well, are you really a person that's never recorded a podcast before going to compare yourself to Joe Rogan, man that's recorded 1,000 and spent 10,000 hours on stage and done all of this UFC commentary and done all of this stuff in terms of TV? Is that really who you're going to compare yourself to? And it's unfair. And the problem that I see is people who have big dreams for themselves and want to do great things, they like to set their sights high.
Yeah.
And yet they feel despondent in the comparison.
Yeah.
So I think
there's a pride in that too, eh?
I can be. I want to be.
Well, or that's who I should be comparing myself to, right? That's the pride. And the pride is something like, I should be that, or even I could be that. It's like, well, maybe you could, but you're certainly not going to do it, as you already pointed out, without the apprenticeship, right? So you could say that the despondency is actually is in proportion to the false pride. Now, I wrote a chapter in, I think, my first book, which was compare yourself to who you are today, not to who someone else is. Sorry, I mangled that to some degree, but you get the point. The proper comparison group for you is you yesterday. Mm-hmm. Because you can make, first of all, you're
comparing yourself yesterday to you today.
That's appropriate to you, because you have a certain set of talents and possibilities and limitations and tragedies that are truly unique to you. And so you might be comparing yourself to someone else on some dimension, but it's not a reasonable comparison, because you don't know what talents they were blessed with, and you also don't know what opportunities they had that you didn't, etc. It's just not a reasonable comparison. It's a lot better to think about who you were, and then to think, well, could you be somewhat better in some dimension? And the positive thing about that is the answer is almost always yes. Now, you can orient that transformation towards some stellar target, and that's a reasonable thing to do, but that doesn't exactly mean that you should compare yourself to that target. Aiming at something and comparing yourself to it are not exactly the same thing. Plus, your bloody comparison is also a delusion. You know, that's another thing that you have to understand, is that you look at the person you're jealous of, and really what you're doing is you're looking through a very narrow aperture at a very thin slice of their life. You're looking at the thin slice of their life that's turning out the best,
everything.
But you're also looking at a thin slice of their life that's marketed to be the best, right? And you have no idea what the horror
sides
of
of
that person's life might be in its totality.
Yeah,
And you have no
that's true.
idea if the deal was, say you wanted to be Russell Brand. There's a good example. You wanted to be Russell Brand. You wanted to be as charismatic and as famous as he is. Well, your real wish is that you get to have everything Russell Brand has, but none of his problems. Well, come on. I mean, it's no wonder that a vision like that would make you despondent, because it's naive, it's resentful, it's jealous, it's bitter, and it's unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take the good with the bad. You have to take the bad with the good.
Everything
And people
comes together.
Rarely think about that when they're thinking about
Being
the famous
somebody.
people
Yeah,
they
yeah.
think they'd like to be.
True,
There was
that's
a
true.
recent interview with Elon Musk
That's so
where
true.
he said something. My mind is a storm. I don't think most people would want to be me.
Right.
They may think they
They
would want to
want
be
to
me,
be me.
but they don't. They don't know. They don't understand. What do you think of that? Elon's someone that people probably look up to and admire
Yeah, well,
and aspire
you know,
to be.
One of the downsides to high-level genius is you might describe it as hypomania. So here's a simple test that people can do. So this is a test of something called verbal fluency, and verbal fluency is associated with creativity. And so here's a simple verbal fluency test. Write down as many four-letter words as you can in 3 minutes that begin with T. Okay, that's pretty constrained, 4 letters
Like
of T.
genius.
Or write down as many words as you can in 3 minutes that begin with S. That's less constrained. All right, so there's quite a powerful correlation between the sheer number of words that you produce and your lifetime creative achievement, right? Especially in the artistic and verbal domains. That's different than vocabulary. Vocabulary is how many words you understand. Fluency is how many words you can produce in a given amount of
Deployment
time.
of those
Yeah.
words. Yeah.
Well, people vary to a degree that you can hardly imagine. So some people, if you get them to do the 4-letter test in 3 minutes, they'll write down like 12 words. And some will write down 150. And the ones who are writing down 150, their minds are going at a hypomanic rate.
Fast.
They're just thinking 5 times as
Bing,
fast
bing,
as...
bing, 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 bing.
Yeah,
Wow.
without any remission whatsoever.
Wow.
And when that gets completely out of control, you have manic. You have someone who's manic. And there's
Like
nothing
psycho.
fun about manic. That's
Yeah.
where the word maniac comes from. And someone who's manic has 1,000 different plans, each of which are 1 sentence long, that they're hyper enthusiastic about. They'll spend every cent of their money pursuing them, and things just go immediately to hell. And so that's the outer limit of pathology on the creative front. And someone like Musk, who's clearly a genius, that's what he's contending with in his internal landscape. Now, I'm not saying that he's manic, because I see no signs of that, but someone that creative is on that edge. Or you see someone like Ben Shapiro. I mean, it's very interesting to talk to Ben, and Russell Brand is the same way. Shapiro speaks, I think, more rapidly than anyone I ever met. But if you're with him, you see very clearly that he's probably thinking 5 times that fast. And that's a lot. And when I was writing Maps of Meaning, which was my first book, I had a very difficult time shutting off my mind. I was obsessed with that book. And so I was writing about 3 hours a day. And then I was thinking about the material like for 12 hours. And the thoughts came as way faster than thinking. They probably came about as fast as I can read. I can read about 1,200 words a minute if the material isn't overwhelmingly dense.
Oh my God.
And so it was just non-stop thought for like 16 hours a day. That's part of the reason I started lifting weights. Because if I was lifting heavy
Can't be
enough weights,
thinking at
that would...
1,200 words a
Yeah,
minute.
you're
while
not-
I've got
yeah.
pounds on my back.
Exactly. It was
Yeah,
enough
yeah, yeah.
to. It was enough to shut it down.
Shut it down to
Yeah.
thinking.
It was also one of the reasons that I drank, because that was another thing that would shut it off.
Yeah.
Oh my
Well,
God,
I
that's
think
like overthinking,
the
bro.
price that people pay
Thinking
to be the person
fast.
that you admire is just such an interesting frame. To look at someone like Elon Musk. My mind is a storm. I don't think most people would want to be me. The price that you would have to pay in order to be me is not one that you would. But you're one of the richest men on the planet, and you get to dance on stage and release cars that are bulletproof and put rockets in space and
Right.
stuff. Well, yeah, but what about all of the baggage? What's the price? What's
Well,
the entry
he also appears to me to be hyper conscientious, and I know people who've worked with him. Like, Musk isn't just a creative genius, he's also an extremely conscientious engineer, and really conscientious engineers, they have very interesting minds. I like talking to engineers because my brother-in-law is a great engineer, and when he understands something, Jim, when he understands something, he understands how to build it out of atoms, right? Like, he understands it at every single level. And Musk appears to me to be someone who's this rare combination of hyper creative but also hyper conscientious.
Does
And I
that
know
wrangle-
he works all the time.
Yeah, does that sort of hypertrophied executive function help to wrangle some of the diffuse creative energy? Oh, we're going to put it into this one thing at least for a while, and then we'll move on to another thing.
Yes, definitely. Eric Weinstein's a good example of someone. I hope Eric isn't annoyed by this, but Eric is unbelievably creative, but he's not particularly conscientious, and so and I think he found an occupation where that works extremely well, because I don't know if he's still doing this, but he worked with Peter Thiel for quite a long time as his idea man, right? And Eric's an extremely interesting person. Musk is hyper creative, and as far as I can tell, hyper conscientious, and the conscientiousness does focus. And that lots of people who are creative aren't conscientious. Well, it's rare. Like, if you're there's no correlation between creativity and conscientiousness. Okay, so
They have this saying that says, if you want to be great, follow what the great one does. If you want to be great, follow what you see great people do. So, in a sense, as he just said, Musk says his mind is like a storm. Many wouldn't want to be him if they know what it's like to be him with a mind of his. So, but there's always a way to make it through whatever you're trying to make it through. But if you want to be great, it's good to follow or admire and look at other great people and see what they do to be great. And that's a great start to becoming great.
1 in 1,000, if you're the most creative person in 1,000, and you're the most conscientious person in 1,000, you're one person in 1,000,000. And Musk is probably more like one person in 100 million, right? Something like that, maybe more, or maybe 1 billion, right? Maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting to consider the changes that happen to people as well as their platforms, as the scrutiny around them continues to increase. Obviously, this has been a journey for you over the last, nearly approaching 10 years now. Was it 2006? Was that still C16?
2016.
2016, yeah, sorry. How have you found fame change you? What's been impacted or changed due to the scrutiny and the surveillance and the adoration and the criticism?
Well, the first thing that changed, I think, was that I saw misery on a scale that I hadn't really seen it before. I had worked as a clinician for a long time, and I worked with, say, 20 people a week, and I was always in the realm of difficult existential problems, wrestling with my clients' problems alongside them, and I liked that a lot. And then I had my research, and I had my family, and various business interests, and so that misery in some ways was contained and boxed in, and I had a lot of structure around that to be able to function despite the fact that I was neck deep in 20 people's serious problems, which I really liked, by the way. When I started speaking on a larger scale and meeting more and more people, this scale of demoralization really hit me. I didn't know how deep the demoralization in our culture had become. And I think that was especially obvious to me at that point among young men. Now, it looks like, this is Jonathan Haidt's research is indicating this, that possibly young women are even in worse shape. But for whatever reason, most of the people I was meeting, at least to begin with, were young men. I think it was probably because most of them, far more people on YouTube, are young men. And so it was shocking and
Really?
brutal to see how much demoralization, how widely spread the demoralization in our culture was. Other than that, and that was a real shock, and it was very hard on me, I would say. Everything else about it has been, at minimum, ridiculously interesting. I have an unbelievable wealth of opportunity. I'd be a fool to be anything but abjectly grateful. I mean, the misery that I saw was a shock, and it hurt me, and it was part of what made me ill.
How did that impact you? Did it change the way that you see the world at all?
It made me understand more deeply how important it was to offer people an encouraging word. I could see that so many people were dying psychologically or actually for lack of an encouraging word. And so it made being in the position to provide that much more necessary. And part of the reason that Tammy and I tour constantly is because it seems to be good. It seems to be a good thing. You know, we've even seen changes in the audience. So 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we did our first tour, a lot of the people who came to the talks were in pretty rough shape. There were more men than there are now, like the proportion of men to women was higher. And the men were generally there alone, and a lot of them were looking pretty ragged around the edges. And now, 5 years later, half the audience comes in suits. It's as if they're dressed for a wedding. Most of the guys are there with some woman. The audience members are doing much better, and the lecture events are extremely positive. You know, if you looked at my life from the outside, you'd think that I was in a constant storm of, you know, aggravated controversy, but all of that, virtually all of that, is virtual. It's just in the online world. Now, it touches the actual world from time to time because I am being pursued by my regulatory college in Ontario. Camp. Yeah, which is, you know, mostly just an annoyance, and a preposterous annoyance, a preposterous, expensive, and time-consuming annoyance. But apart from that, everything that's happened around me has been positive. That's a strange thing too. Positive at such an intensity that even that is daunting. You know, you'd think it's hard to imagine that you could be in a situation where things are so positive that you can barely stand it. But I am in that situation, and it's quite something to contend with. I was fortunate, I suppose, to some degree, that it didn't happen to me till I was old, because I've never really got accustomed to it.
I've had a thought about this, observing what's happened to you, and you know, the Weinsteins are a good example of this too. We often hear the perils of getting fame too young. Mm-hmm. The Macaulay Culkins of the world, the Britney Spears of the world, you know, individuals who don't have any sense of identity being thrust into a non-representative experience of the world, and they're completely unmoored. But I think that there's an equally interesting question to ask, okay, and what happens if you think you know who you are? If you've spent decades, 5 decades, 6 decades of your life understanding your place, your status, the trajectory that you're on, and then out of nowhere you get ripped away from all of the areas of reference, all of the way markers that you thought you knew, and now you're just floating in the air. I imagine that could be even more disquieting in some ways.
Well, when everything blew up around me to begin with, it was stressful, I would say, because my job was on the line, my university job, and I never thought that would happen. I mean, when I worked at Harvard and at the University of Toronto, that was all positive. Like, I really liked working with my graduate students. I had at least cordial relationships with my fellow faculty members. At Harvard, they were more than cordial. At the University of Toronto, most of the faculty members that I started to develop friendships with were also those who ended up moving away. And so
it's a whole long interview. It's a whole long podcast interview, so I'm not going to bore you guys out. I'm going to stop it right here. in a few, but the interview, if you guys want to see more, the interview is on Chris Williamson's channel, and you guys could check it out. But let me know what you guys think. Let me know what the information that was given, what did it do for you, how did it benefit you, or how did you feel about it, how do you feel about it. And I know it's a deep conversation, and a conversation like this definitely goes long, so I'm not trying to bore you out or anything, but I hope you guys like it, and I hope you guys stay tuned for, more similar topics whatsoever like this, and check it out.
More often people who got offers from other places, and
Right.
they would disappear, and so a lot of the friends I developed at the University of Toronto went elsewhere, and so I didn't get as tightly tied in